An autumn night's gift, and a key that opens no lock. That afternoon, autumn sunlight spilled gently like flecks of gold onto the windowsill. I stood by the stove, a warm mug of tea in hand, gazing off toward the old oak tree at the end of the lane, a silent companion of nearly 20 years since my son moved to the city to start his life. Everything was calm, familiar. Just another Thursday evening. Until the doorbell rang. Not loud, not hurried, but slow, hesitant, like whoever stood behind the door wasn't sure they should be there at all. I stepped out and opened the door. Standing there, bathed in the final glow of sunset, was Daniel, the neighbor who lived across the street. We'd exchanged polite hellos over the fence, helped each other with the garbage or a porch light now and then, but nothing more. "Good evening, Claire," he said, his voice warm, a bit husky from the chill. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I have a small gift." He held out a small box wrapped carefully in forest green paper and tied with a velvet ribbon. I hesitated, then accepted it politely. "What's the occasion?" Daniel smiled faintly. "There isn't one. I just think some things are better given before it's too late. Open it later, and if you feel like it, I'd love to invite you for a coffee tomorrow, 7 p.m. at the little cafe on the corner." I watched as his tall, lean figure disappeared behind his front door, my hand tightening slightly around the box, as if it held something both fragile and serious. When I untied the ribbon and opened it, I paused. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple, elegant, and hanging from the center, a charm shaped like a key. Small, intricate, and somehow heavy. Beneath the bracelet was a folded note handwritten in clear script. "Some things are left unsaid, but sometimes a small key can open a door we didn't know was closed. If you're even a little curious, I'll be at the old cafe 7 p.m. tomorrow. Daniel." I sat down at the kitchen table, heart skipping like a girl in her 20s. What was this, a joke? A long-delayed kindness, or a whisper of fate? I didn't sleep that night. The words from the note circled in my mind. The key? What door? What was he really saying? And me, a middle-aged woman with a quiet life and a heart I thought had long since closed, was I willing to open that door? The next morning, I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. It fit with an uncanny ease, as if it had always belonged to me. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I saw a faint light in my eyes, not because I knew what was coming, but because for once, I wanted to find out. If you've ever received a gift that made you hesitate to open it, let Senior Love Stories open the door to something quietly beautiful. Don't forget to subscribe for stories that feel like they belong in a movie, but are quietly blooming, even now, in real life. Life whispers, where grown-up hearts find their way home. The little cafe sat tucked along the narrow street one I had passed many times, but hadn't stepped into in years. It had a round glass window and a wind chime that gave a soft, familiar jingle every time someone pushed open the door. That evening, I arrived a few minutes early. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the handle. The chime sounded like a whispering welcome. Daniel was already there, sitting in a corner under the soft glow of amber lights. He wore a navy sweater and held a cup of coffee in both hands, elbows resting lightly on the table. He looked calm, still, but not out of place. When he saw me, he stood up quickly. His expression held both relief and hesitation, like he had been holding his breath, wondering if I would really show up. "Claire, thank you for coming." I sat down, my heart still tripping over questions left unanswered from the night before. The bracelet with its small silver key still circled my wrist. I hadn't been able to leave it behind. It felt like a bridge to whatever story was waiting to unfold. Daniel looked down for a moment, then spoke slowly, honestly. "Do you remember Mrs. Richards, the woman who used to live next door?" I nodded. She loved her flowers, always wore a wide-brimmed hat when she gardened, and used to call me her resilient girl. She was well into her years, but her eyes sparkled as if she knew far more than she ever let on. Daniel exhaled gently. "She was my aunt. After my mother passed, she was the only family I had left. I used to visit her every weekend. You probably never saw me because I always came through the back gate." I blinked. Pieces started fitting together. "Before she passed," he continued, "she asked me for one thing: to look out for Claire. Not because she thought you needed help, but because she said some of the strongest people sometimes just need someone to stand beside them, to remind them they're not alone." My throat tightened. Maybe after the divorce and after my son moved away, I had become so used to the quiet of this house, I'd convinced myself I was okay. But those words, they made something small inside me unravel. I felt seen, small, yes, but seen. Daniel went on his fingers, resting near his coffee cup, not touching mine, but close enough that I felt it. "I thought a long time about how to approach you. I didn't want to intrude on your world, so I tried the gentlest way I knew, a gift, an invitation. And the key, it doesn't open any real lock, but I hoped it might open something else, if you were willing." I smiled softly, caught between emotion and uncertainty. My coffee was cooling, but somehow the space between us was warming. "So, what should I understand from all this?" I asked, half joking, half curious. Daniel looked at me, his gaze steady and kind. "I'm not looking for anything. I just wanted you to know if one day you ever want to share something or just sit beside someone in silence, I'm here. And if not, that's okay too. I just wanted you to know." I didn't answer right away. I simply nodded, quietly. And my fingers instinctively tightened around the bracelet on my wrist, the tiny silver key that somehow seemed to be unlocking a door I hadn't dared face in years. A door called trust in someone new, in a new chapter, and maybe most of all, in myself again. In the days following our coffee at the cafe, Daniel and I didn't speak much. No texts, no casual check-ins, but strangely, the silence didn't unsettle me. On the contrary, it felt necessary, like a quiet pause that let my heart slowly sense that something was shifting. I began to notice him more. Each morning when I pulled back the curtain, I would see Daniel watering his plants, carefully tending the lavender bushes that lined his porch. Sometimes I'd catch him wheeling his trash bin to the curb and quietly heading back inside, same muted sweater, same unhurried gait. And somehow, those small, ordinary actions were like drops of rain soaking into the dry soil of something inside me. One afternoon, I was outside picking up branches after a restless night of wind when Daniel crossed the fence unexpectedly. In his hands, a shovel and a pair of gardening gloves. "Need a hand?" he asked, offering a gentle smile. I almost refused, as I often did out of habit, but this time I nodded. Maybe. I was tired of pretending I always had it together. We worked quietly on the small yard. Daniel pointed out some plants with wilted roots and neatly trimmed them for me. I watched in silence his steady movements, the unspoken care in every cut. No showmanship, no performance, just presence. Afterward, I poured 2 glasses of lemonade and invited him to sit with me on the porch steps. "Are you always like this?" I asked. "Showing up quietly when people need someone?" He shrugged, eyes soft at the corners. "I think sometimes being there silently says more than any comforting words ever could." I didn't respond, but something in my chest tightened, not from pain, but from a deep, familiar feeling I hadn't touched in years, the rare, quiet joy of being understood. Not through explanation, just seen. Simply seen. As Daniel stood up to leave, I called after him gently. "Daniel." He turned. I hesitated, then added, "I appreciate the bracelet, the coffee, today, your presence." He nodded, smile unreadable somewhere between wistful and warm. "Claire, thank you for letting me in. Sometimes, that's more than I could ever ask." That night, I sat alone in my old armchair by the window. The breeze carried the scent of lavender from his yard. I held the bracelet in my hand, my fingertips brushing the silver key. And maybe what brought the most peace wasn't that someone had entered my life loudly or passionately, but that someone had walked beside me quietly enough to make me want to open my heart just a little more every day. That evening, after Daniel had gone home, I sat quietly in front of the old photo frame on the bookshelf, the picture of me and my husband when we were young. His eyes in the photo still looked the same, gentle, full of trust, but my heart was no longer whole the way it was back then. I picked up the frame to dust it off as I usually did, but my hand froze when I realized the frame had been moved, tilted ever so slightly as if someone had picked it up and hurriedly placed it back down. A small detail, but for someone who lives alone like I do, even the slightest change is impossible to miss. I stood walking slowly around the living room. Nothing was out of place, no signs of intrusion. And yet, inside me, something stilled, as if a long dormant part had just stirred. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had nudged the bookshelf. Or maybe it was a quiet reminder that it was time to face the past. I set the frame down on the table and silently walked into my bedroom. I opened the nightstand drawer, looking for my old journal, the one I used to scribble thoughts I never said aloud. My hand brushed against something cold and small. A key. I stared at it for a moment, trying to recall what it unlocked. Then, like a flicker of light through fog, I saw it, the attic. The small room upstairs I'd locked up years ago after my husband passed away. I hadn't stepped foot there since. Key in hand, I stood at the base of the staircase. A breeze from the upper window brushed against my sleeve. The scent of old wood, untouched memories. It all seemed to call me back to a chapter I had folded away. The attic opened under soft yellow light. Everything was just as I had left it. Old cardboard boxes, a few unfinished paintings, and a wooden chest dusted with time. I sat down, took a deep breath, and opened the box. Inside were letters, handwritten notes exchanged between me and my husband in our early years. The words were clumsy, innocent, but overflowing with love. I picked one up and read it. Waves of memory washed over me. And in that moment, I realized through all the years I hadn't just locked away a room. I had locked away my heart. Not only because of grief, but because I was afraid that if I opened the door, the memories would flood in and drown me. But Daniel, he hadn't barged through. He simply left a key and waited patiently, gently for me to decide if I wanted to open the door. I walked back downstairs and sat at the table. I placed the bracelet beside the old key. 2 keys, 2 doors, one to the past, one to the present. I didn't know how far Daniel would go in my world, but I knew one thing for certain: it was time to stop locking things away. That night, I sent him a short message. I opened the old door. "Thank you for the new key. Can we meet this weekend?" No reply came immediately, but I smiled, not because I was anxious to hear back, but because for the first time in years, I felt a little lighter. Some people enter our lives not to change the entire world, but simply to hand us a key and remind us we still have the right to step into the light. I never thought a quiet evening could stir so much within me. When Daniel stepped over my doorstep that day, holding a small basket with 2 servings of hot soup and a crusty, fragrant loaf of bread, I didn't know whether to be surprised, touched, or cautious. "I heard it's colder today," he said, eyes briefly scanning the warmth of my kitchen. And sometimes, a simple meal can ease a day filled with heavy thoughts. I smiled gently, ushering him in. Under the soft glow of the lights as the old wooden chairs creaked beneath our familiar steps, I realized it had been a long time since this space held 2 people sitting across from each other. The table once set for one suddenly felt snug, not because there wasn't room, but because my heart was now making space for someone else. We sat together, sipping the sweet warmth of the soup crunching into golden slices of bread. I shared with him about the attic, about the letters I had reopened, and about the fear that had silently bound my heart for so many years. I used to think that if I held everything tightly, the pain wouldn't escape, I said. But the truth is, that's exactly what allowed it to eat away at me from the inside. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply placed his hand on the table, close enough for me to feel its warmth, yet far enough to show he wouldn't reach further unless I was ready. "Claire," he said quietly after a while. Every door eventually opens, not because someone forces it, but because the person inside finally finds the courage to turn the key. "I'm glad you did." I looked at him, really looked for the first time in a long time. In the flicker of candlelight, I saw a man who had known silence, but hadn't lost his patience. Maybe love doesn't always arrive with thunder or lightning. Maybe sometimes it simply sits beside us in the dark, quiet, steady, and willing to wait. After dinner, Daniel rose and helped me clean. As his hands washed the dishes, I stood beside him, drying them like a couple long accustomed to moving in sync. We didn't say much, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was soft, shared, and full. When I walked him to the door, I hesitated not out of regret, but because I didn't quite know how to end a night that had been just intimate enough to stir something, and just distant enough to leave it undefined. "Thank you for today," I said, voice softer than my breath. Daniel smiled. "Thank you for letting me in." I began to close the door, but just then he turned back hesitant. "Claire?" he asked, "do you believe a key can sometimes open more than a door? Maybe even a heart?" I didn't answer. I simply nodded, a quiet promise spoken without words. And as the door closed behind him, my heart no longer felt heavy. It felt lighter, as if someone had gently placed a small piece of peace upon it. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to Senior Love Stories so you won't miss what comes next. Because sometimes even a whispered tale can awaken a memory deep inside you. Let us help you hold on to the moments that matter with stories that carry the heart of time. The next morning, I found a small letter slipped under my door. Not an email, not a text message, but a handwritten note in slightly slanted, carefully penned script. "If you have time, I'd like to share something with you. Meet me at the park by the lake, 10 a.m. D." I arrived right on time, carrying a mix of nerves and anticipation. Daniel was already there, seated quietly with a cream-colored envelope resting beside him, its edges faded with age. He invited me to sit, his face thoughtful, weighed by something he hadn't yet said. I found this in my aunt's old keepsakes. Daniel began placing the envelope in my hand. At first, I thought I'd keep it. But then I realized maybe you should be the one to open it. I unfolded the flap slowly. Inside was an old photograph, slightly faded. In the image, I was sitting on my front steps, several years younger, beside Mrs. Richards, the woman who had lived next door, the one I used to affectionately call the flower-loving old lady. I smiled at the memory, but my fingers froze when I noticed a third person in the frame, Daniel. He was standing behind the fence, holding a book, his eyes quietly fixed in my direction. He had never told me he'd known me back then. "You were in this photo?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. Daniel nodded. "My aunt took it. But by then, I had already started noticing you. You didn't know, but every time you stopped to chat with her, I'd be under the tree nearby, just listening to your voice." I said nothing. My heart slowed, not from shock, but from the tenderness of it all. A quiet piece of memory, long forgotten, had been held with care by someone else, and now returned to me. Could it be that the deepest affections have always existed silently, simply waiting for the right moment to be revealed? Daniel didn't say much more. He sat beside me, his presence calm and steady. But I understood today wasn't just about an old photograph. It was about a moment, a heart opening without fanfare. Sometimes people don't need to say, "I love you," to show you they do. Sometimes just holding on to a photo for years is enough. We sat there a long time on the wooden bench, facing the lake, watching sunlight shimmer across the falling leaves. And inside me, something began to grow, not loudly, not urgently, but gently. Like the way Daniel had always been there, waiting unnoticed until I was finally still enough to see. "Claire," he said softly after a long silence, "I don't regret staying quiet all these years, but if I could do it over, I'd speak sooner. Because love shouldn't be something we keep locked away. It deserves to live." I turned to him, smiling faintly. The photo was folded now, carefully placed in my coat pocket, not to be hidden, but to be carried. Just like I would carry the memory of his gaze from all those years ago, from across that old garden fence. Have you ever kept a photo no one else knew about? An unspoken look that stayed with you for years? Then subscribe to Senior Love Stories, because sometimes we tell the story you've been holding quietly in your heart. And remind you, no matter how many years have passed, the heart can begin again as long as you're willing to open the door. I'm not sure why I turned the lights down low that evening, or why I brewed a pot of tea instead of pouring my usual glass of red wine. All I know is when the knock came at just before 8 p.m., I wasn't surprised. It felt expected. Daniel stood there, not with flowers, not with candles, but with a gaze warm enough to soften even the silence of years. "I know it's a bit late," he said gently, "but I just finished a song, and I thought, if anyone should hear it first, it's you." I opened the door and quietly invited him in. We didn't speak much, just the soft sound of his acoustic guitar filled the room. The melody had no name, but I knew it was written for me. Some notes felt like whispers. Others pressed against the quiet aching like a heartbeat held too long. I sat beside him, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, listening without words, letting him tell me everything, through sound alone. When the music ended, he set the guitar down and looked up at me. "Are you afraid," he asked, "that someone like me might show up and disturb the peace you've built?" I smiled. "You didn't disturb it, Daniel. You opened a new door. Sometimes peace is just a disguise for loneliness." He said nothing, only bowed his head. And when he looked back at me, his eyes, they were the same eyes from the faded photograph years ago. Only now they weren't hidden behind a fence. They were close, so close I could finally see everything he'd never said. We sat across from each other in the glow of a single candle, not for romance, but because the softness of it matched the rhythm of what was unfolding between us. It felt like our story, too, needed a slower pace, a gentler light, so nothing precious would shatter too soon. Daniel told me about the song, how he'd written it during sleepless nights, how he had imagined this very moment 1,000 times, and still wasn't sure it would feel real. "I've never been sure of many things in life, Claire," he said, "but sitting here with you now, hearing nothing but your quiet presence, I've never been more certain of anything." I didn't respond. I simply reached for the teapot and poured him a small cup, my way of saying yes. A beginning without fanfare. Not all relationships begin with a confession. Sometimes they start with a melody, with a chair quietly saved for someone who's never asked, with a look honest enough that no one needs to say, "Are we walking the same path?" That night, Daniel didn't stay long, but as he left, he placed a small folded note on the table. It read, "If tomorrow you still feel like listening, I'll come back with another song and a coffee, no sugar, just the way you said you liked it." I smiled, folded the note, and tucked it into the back of that old photograph, as if I were saving the first page of a new chapter, one where the heart no longer whispers in secret, but begins to speak its truth out loud. The next day, the weather felt unusually kind. The sun was no longer harsh, filtered through thin clouds, casting a soft, golden glow across the tree canopy outside the porch. I brewed a pot of coffee, no sugar, just as Daniel had mentioned, and set 2 porcelain cups on the small wooden table on the balcony. Some afternoons don't need to be planned. They arrive on their own, when both hearts are quietly hoping for them to come. Right on time, the doorbell rang, not rushed, not abrupt, but soft, like footsteps you've already grown used to hearing. I opened the door. Daniel stood there, not with a guitar or a wrapped gift this time, but with an old leather notebook and a smile light as the early summer breeze. "I didn't bring music," he said, "but I brought a few things I've been meaning to share." We sat at the small table. The warmth of the coffee rose gently, blending with the scent of jasmine in the air. It created a space that felt strangely familiar and tender. Daniel opened the notebook, turning the pages not to read aloud, but to revisit moments from the life he'd once walked through. He told me about his early days moving to the city, his failures the nights he slept on park benches, and the one love he lost, not because of betrayal, but because he hadn't dared to speak his heart. "I lived an entire chapter of my life with a single regret," he said, "that sometimes we're so afraid of being hurt, we end up hiding the truth, and by the time we're ready to return, every door has already closed." I said nothing. I just stirred my coffee slowly. Some stories aren't shared for consolation. They're shared to be heard, to feel less alone, to know that a scar doesn't make you any less trustworthy. So I said I stayed silent too for years. I thought if I kept the pain to myself, it would disappear. But I learned that the thing we bury deepest is the very thing that eats at us the most. We looked at each other, not searching for answers, but simply acknowledging the truth that we had both survived enough lonely days, enough headwinds to now cherish this kind of peace. Nothing grand, just 2 people facing each other, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and hearts no longer hiding behind walls. Daniel reached into the notebook and pulled out an old photograph. It was of me standing next to Mrs. Richards, the late neighbor who once lived next door. "She took this picture," he said, "one afternoon while you were cleaning your windows. She told me, 'That girl doesn't know how much light she carries.'" I laughed, eyes misty. Some part of me felt quietly healed by something so simple, to know that even when I thought I was living unseen, someone had noticed, remembered, and chosen to preserve it. That afternoon, we didn't talk about the future. There were no promises, no questions about how far we'd go. Just 2 people washing cups together, rehanging the wind chime at the porch, and closing a well-worn notebook like closing one chapter to prepare for the next. If you've ever seen someone as a quiet light, if you've ever whispered to yourself, "If only I'd spoken sooner then," Senior Love Stories is for you. Tap, follow. Because here, we tell the stories your heart has always been waiting to hear, stories of tenderness, of doors left unlocked, and of the moment two people chose to stay. That morning, the air had turned crisp, but the sunlight was clear, like a window pane that had never known dust. I woke early, brewed coffee, but this time 2 cups. Not out of habit, but from a quiet certainty that had settled into my breath someone would knock. Not because of an appointment, not out of obligation, simply because they wanted to. And Daniel came. No flowers, no ring, no guitar, just a croissant wrapped in a paper bag, and a line that made me laugh. I thought I should learn to make something for breakfast. But maybe today, we just learned to share breakfast first. We sat on the front steps, the same place I had sipped tea alone for years. But for the first time, someone sat beside me, not taking space away, but making the space fuller. I watched the trees sway softly in the breeze, listened to the old crow across the rooftop, and realized some moments need nothing more than the quiet presence of another. Daniel talked about his late mother, the last winter he had with his father, and the first time he wrote music not for an audience, but for life's simple details, like my morning voice, or how I wrap my scarf when stepping onto the porch at night. I think he said softly, "Some people don't enter your life like thunder. They arrive like a lamp, warm, gentle, and they stay long enough that you stop fearing the dark." I didn't speak. I simply leaned my head on his shoulder, as if every answer life ever owed me could be found in that small, quiet gesture. We didn't promise anything. No plans for weddings. No future mapped out. But I knew this was a beginning. Not because life needed changing, but because my heart had finally matured enough to recognize when someone was worth inviting in. I turned and asked quietly, if one day I wanted to turn these moments into music, would you write them with me? Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "No," he smiled. "You'll write them, and I'll sing." We laughed. The sun tilted across his hair. A breeze swept a golden leaf to rest at my feet, a small closing to the old chapter, and a quiet opening to the new one we were both ready to step into together. If you're reading this and you've ever thought love belongs only to the young, remember Senior Love Stories exists to remind you that there are no age limits on real emotion. Even if you've weathered many seasons of solitude, even if your hair has silvered and your voice has softened, a new song can still begin from a glance from a teacup, from a message that feels ordinary. Follow Senior Love Stories, because here we don't tell fairy tales. We tell truths, beautiful ones, and ones that come late enough to last forever. And if today you find yourself making 2 cups of tea instead of 1, believe this someone is already on their way.